It was a cold November night in 1957 in Carlinville in Illinois, a small rural town known for its tranquility and close-knit community. 23-year-old teacher Margaret Hamilton's Chevrolet Bel Air sat at the side of the road, its engine still running, its headlights cutting through the fog. The driver's door was open, and the radio played softly, broadcasting music from the 1940s. But Margaret was no longer in the car. She had disappeared, leaving behind a scene of apparent normality, but a disturbing mystery. Margaret had spent the evening at a party on the Thompson family farm, celebrating the harvest with neighbors and friends. It was a simple affair, but full of life and laughter. The women were in the kitchen, exchanging recipes and conversations. The men gathered near the barn, smoking and discussing work on the land, and the children played freely in the fields. Enjoying the evening, Margaret arrived around 7 p.m., driving her Chevrolet, a gift from her father, who had encouraged her to pursue a teaching career in Carlinville. She wore a floral dress with a cream cardigan and her hair tied back in a simple bun. Everyone remembers her laughing, dancing to the upbeat music, and helping with the party chores. There was nothing unusual about that night. Around 10:10 m, Margaret said goodbye and began her journey home. She had an appointment the next day, and her friends saw her off from the party, promising to see her at church in the morning. She took the dirt road to her house, a route she took regularly. It was a leisurely 3-mile drive along a country road surrounded by cornfields and pastures. No one imagined that this trip would be the last time they would see Margaret. When Margaret still hadn't returned home after midnight, her sister Dorothy began to worry. The two had lost their parents in a train accident 2 years earlier and had lived together in the small wooden house on Elm Street ever since. Dorothy knew that Margaret sometimes stopped at a local diner for coffee. But when 1 a.m. rolled around and she still hadn't returned, worry set in. So Dorothy called the sheriff. Deputy Frank Moore went to the indicated location and found Margaret's Chevrolet parked oddly on the side of the road, with the driver's door open. The engine was running, the headlights were on, and the radio was playing soft music. Inside the car was Margaret's purse, with her money and documents, but she was gone. Moore checked the surroundings, looking for any signs of violence or struggle. There was no blood, no torn clothing, and no indication that Margaret had been forced from her car. The car appeared to have been quickly abandoned. Moore's flashlight illuminated the darkness of the road, but there was no sign of where Margaret might have gone. He called out to her, but the only answer was the sound of the wind cutting through the surrounding fields. The lack of clues and the stillness of everything only deepened the mystery. When Sheriff Thomas Walsh arrived with more officers, the search for Margaret began immediately. News of Margaret's disappearance spread quickly throughout the town. A small town like Carlinville, with only 3,200 residents, was in shock. The close-knit community, full of strong bonds among its residents, couldn't believe what was happening. The town, which knew every detail of its residents' lives, couldn't fathom the idea that someone like Margaret could vanish without a trace. People began searching everywhere. Farmers, friends, neighbors, and even children all joined the search. Carlinville had never faced anything like this, and the authorities were as lost as the residents. There were no signs, no clues, just a stalled car and an entire town in despair. Sheriff Walsh organized the search meticulously. Volunteers fanned out across the countryside, combing every corner of the area. Hunting dogs were brought in, but they soon lost Margaret's trail. The search expanded throughout the town and surrounding areas, but no one could find any trace to explain her disappearance. With each passing hour, the desperation grew. Dorothy, her sister, was tireless. She was at the center of the search, always offering information and helping where she could. But even with all her hopes, she began to lose faith that her sister would return. Margaret, the woman everyone knew and loved, had disappeared without a trace. The town wondered, how could this happen? How could a respected teacher, beloved by everyone, simply disappear in the middle of the night? A few theories began to circulate. Some residents believed she might have been abducted by a stranger, someone passing through town, but no one could imagine who it might be. Carlinville was a small town where everyone knew everyone else, and the idea that someone unknown had broken into the countryside and taken Margaret seemed unlikely. Weeks passed, and the case began to cool. Newspapers began to lose interest. Searches lessened, and Margaret Hamilton's case gradually became just another unsolved story. Dorothy's grief never diminished, but the community began to move on. Conversations about her disappearance subsided. However, Margaret was far from forgotten. Her image remained vivid in everyone's memories, and the town, though silent, couldn't help but question what had really happened. Then, in 1962, just when everyone thought the case was lost, Albert Becker, a local farmer, made a discovery that would change everything. While digging on his property, he found human remains. The find was immediately reported to the police, and the remains were sent for forensic analysis. Initially, the tests were inconclusive, but the police kept the case open. The evidence wasn't sufficient to make a definitive identification, but the similarities were too uncanny to ignore. Time passed, and with it, new investigations emerged, but without definitive answers. Carlinville, which had long lived with the mystery of Margaret's disappearance, had to move on. Dorothy continued her search, now alone. After the death of her parents, the town, scarred by tragedy, gradually replaced Margaret's memory with new stories and new faces. Margaret Hamilton became a local legend, a story people told on cold nights, a lesson in how even the quietest towns can hide dark secrets. It wasn't until many years later, in 2008, that the reopening of the case and advances in forensic science brought new hope. The case was re-examined with new DNA technologies. And finally, after 51 years of silence, the truth came to light. The body found in 1962 was confirmed as that of Margaret Hamilton, buried in the same field where so many people had searched without knowing what lay just beneath their feet. And with that, the town of Carlinville finally got the answers they had been searching for. But so much time had passed that the pain of what had happened had become even deeper. Margaret Hamilton's story was finally solved, but not without a price. The man who caused her death, Walter Fitzgerald, a pillar of the community, confessed to his crime too late. He spent 51 years living with the guilt, while the entire town searched for a truth he knew all along. The revelation of his involvement shocked everyone, and the town, which trusted him as a good man, had to face the reality that evil can lurk where least expected. When Fitzgerald was arrested and taken to prison, Carlinville finally managed to put Margaret's mystery to rest. But the weight of the truth would never be completely overcome. The town, now forever scarred by tragedy, learned the hard way that trust can be betrayed by the most familiar faces. And Margaret Hamilton, the beloved teacher who had been the soul of the town, finally found her rest. But the pain for those who loved her continued throughout her life. After Walter Fitzgerald's arrest in 2009, Carlinville was shaken by a series of conflicting emotions. The revelation that someone so respected in the community had committed such a horrific crime was difficult to digest. Fitzgerald, who for decades had been seen as a pillar of the town, someone who organized parades, helped with school affairs, and was active in churches and local committees, was now the man responsible for the murder of Margaret Hamilton. That trustworthy figure, who always seemed to have a welcoming smile and kind words for everyone, was in reality the murderer of an innocent woman he had known for so long. The people of Carlinville, who saw themselves as a close-knit community, began to question what they really knew about each other. How could they have lived next to someone capable of committing such an act and never suspected it? Throughout the investigation, many questions arose. How had he managed to hide the crime for so long? How had no one noticed the sudden change in his life and personality? Fitzgerald had always been the friend, the counselor, the man who helped others. His life seemed perfect: a devoted wife, young children, a thriving hardware store, a seemingly trouble-free existence. But he carried a dark secret, and for all those years, he managed to hide it from everyone, living with the guilt of his actions but never paying for it. The details of his confession were captured on videotape, a moment in which Fitzgerald, already weakened by Parkinson's disease, revealed to Detective Lawrence Gallagher and the city police officers what really happened that November night in 1957. He explained, in his trembling voice, that he had always felt an attraction to Margaret, something he could not control. She, in turn, had always been kind and professional to him, but she never shared his feelings. On the night of the party, he could take it no longer. After dropping his wife off, he returned to the road, where he knew he would find Margaret, alone in her car. He claimed he wanted to talk about his daughter's education, but in reality, he was planning something much darker. Fitzgerald's confession was painful, not only for the town, but for himself as well. He said that the moment he approached Margaret, his repressed feelings overcame his reason. When she rejected him, he lost control. He attacked her, fatally striking her. Desperation consumed him, and in an impulsive act, he dragged her to his truck and took her to Morrison's woods, where he buried her under a layer of leaves and earth. Fitzgerald spent the following years living with the guilt of what he had done, but also with the constant fear that the truth would be discovered. He had to bear the weight of his crime with every smile, every gesture of kindness. While the town searched for a woman, he knew exactly where she was, and although the case was forgotten by many, Fitzgerald could not forget Margaret. He saw her in his dreams, in every quiet moment, and his guilt slowly consumed him. But he never had the courage to confess until death found him with a ruthless hand. Fitzgerald's arrest brought a sense of relief to some Apries, but also immense grief to others. Many were still reeling from the discovery that he, the man everyone trusted, was responsible for the crime. For the residents of Carlinville, the sense of distrust and betrayal was a difficult blow to process. For years, Fitzgerald had been the person they trusted to help, advise, and do good. But he had hidden behind this facade, and no one would have ever imagined he was capable of such cruelty. The case, though finally solved, didn't exactly bring the peace the town had hoped for. The town of Carlinville was scarred, and Margaret's loss would never be fully overcome. For Dorothy, her sister, the pain of losing her sister was compounded by the reality that she never knew what had truly happened. Dorothy died in 2003 before seeing the resolution of the case she had sought so desperately throughout her life. She had written countless letters and made many phone calls, asking for answers to what happened that night. But she never received a satisfactory answer while she was alive. In 2009, with Fitzgerald's arrest, the town felt a sense of closure, but also an enormous amount of sadness. Margaret would never return. The families who suffered the consequences of her death, especially Dorothy's, could finally begin to deal with what remained, the void left by her absence. The story of Margaret Hamilton, long considered a lost cause, became a painful lesson in what can happen when evil hides behind familiar faces. The town of Carlinville, once certain that a good man had made a mistake, now had to live with the reality that evil can arise from where it is least expected. The truth, while liberating for some, left deep scars. Margaret Hamilton's case was officially reopened in 2008, and the remains found in 1962 were identified as hers through DNA analysis. The town finally had the answer it had been waiting for, but the pain of learning the truth didn't bring the hoped-for peace. Carlinville was forever scarred by the tragedy, and its residents would never be the same. Margaret's story would be remembered for generations, not only as a mystery, but also as a reminder of how easy it is to ignore the signs of what's right before our eyes. When Margaret was finally buried next to her sister Dorothy, in a town-wide ceremony, the Carlinville pasture was filled with grief. The town was finally able to say goodbye to her. But the legacy of pain, the search for answers, and broken trust would remain, etched in the memories of all who once knew her. Following Walter Fitzgerald's arrest and confession, the town of Carlinville seemed to be in a state of collective shock. While the revelation of his involvement in Margaret Hamilton's murder was a relief for many, it also brought to the surface immense pain. Conversations in the town now revolved around how someone like Fitzgerald, who for years had been seen as a pillar of the community, someone everyone trusted, could be responsible for such a horrific act. The man who had attended parties, helped out at schools, and been a friend to most residents, was now revealed as a criminal with a dark secret no one knew about. The residents of Carlinville were disturbed by the idea that evil could lurk so close, camouflaged by a facade of kindness and trustworthiness. How could this happen? How had no one noticed he'd been carrying this guilt for so long? Throughout all those years, Fitzgerald never showed any signs that anything was wrong, which only heightened the shock of his revelation. He kept his distance from the truth, but his guilt, though never confessed until that moment, slowly consumed him. Many in the town couldn't understand how he had hidden it for so long, how he managed to continue his life as if nothing had happened, without letting on that. In fact, he carried such a heavy burden. Walter Fitzgerald spent years living with the anguish of a secret that gnawed at him. However, until his arrest, he never admitted what he had done. He knew where Margaret's body was, but no one ever suspected him. The fact that he had been a respected man in the community, with a seemingly intact life, cleared him of suspicion. But what no one knew was that Fitzgerald had become a hostage to his own mind, living with such profound shame that he remained silent for over 5 decades. He feared what would happen if he were discovered. But more than that, he feared having to face the harsh reality of his unthinkable act. When he was arrested, Fitzgerald was already ill. Parkinson's disease had weakened him, and he was in a very weak physical state. He did not resist arrest and, after being questioned for more than 2 weeks, finally broke down and confessed. The confession was a moment of great tension, where he, with a trembling voice, detailed how he had lost control on the night of November 16, 1957. He said that, in that moment, everything he felt for Margaret overflowed into rage and despair, and he committed the most unthinkable crime. The pain on Fitzgerald's face during his confession was visible, but it was also clear he was relieved, as if the truth had finally come out, even if it was too late. Recounting how he had approached Margaret that night, he spoke of a desperate attempt to talk about something personal, an attempt to justify his presence there. But Margaret's words, that she saw him only as a friend and did not share his feelings, were the trigger for his anger, and what happened next was something he could never forget. After Fitzgerald's confession, the town of Carlinville was overcome with a mixture of relief and revulsion. Although the truth had finally come to light, the emotional impact on the residents was devastating. Carlinville would never be the same, and no one would ever look at Fitzgerald the same way again. The man everyone suspected would never have been capable of such a monstrous thing. But that's exactly what he did. He destroyed lives, and the pain he caused Margaret's sister, Dorothy, was unbearable. For years, Dorothy struggled to find answers, and when she finally received news of Fitzgerald's arrest, she had already lost her own battle, passing away in 2003, never knowing the truth. She had been a leading advocate for answers, always asking questions, always hoping someone would bring the truth to light, but she never had the chance to see justice served. Her death before the case was solved left a void in the community, especially because she was one of the few who never gave up on the truth, never lost hope that her sister would be found. For her, the search for answers never ended. Now, with Fitzgerald finally facing justice, many in the town felt closure, but not without a sense of bitterness. The town finally had the answers it had so desperately sought, but the pain it caused was irreparable. Carlinville had to deal with the fact that, even though the case was solved, the trust people had in those around them was irreparably broken. The revelation that Fitzgerald, someone everyone expected the best from, was responsible for Margaret's death left a bitter taste in everyone's mouth. The case of Margaret Hamilton became a story that would be remembered for generations to come, not only as a young teacher gone missing, but as a painful lesson in how evil can lurk in places we least expect. The fact that someone everyone trusted could commit such a crime undetected, and for so many years, taught the community that sometimes the truth can be harder to accept than any lie. Fitzgerald, who spent his entire life with a weight on his shoulders, paid for his crime too late. Although he expressed regret, the pain he caused could never be erased. In 2009, when Fitzgerald was finally arrested, the town of Carlinville celebrated the end of a long wait. However, the sense of relief was mixed with great sadness. The families who had lost someone or who had been touched by the case would never be the same. Margaret Hamilton, the beloved teacher, had been stolen from her family and friends one November night, and the entire town, in a way, was also robbed of the certainty that good people are immune to such cruel actions. When the community gathered to pay their last respects to Margaret, a memorial was held in her memory in a ceremony that moved the entire town. People gathered at the church where she used to play the piano, and for the first time in many years, the town of Carlinville felt that something had been resolved. The pain, though still present, was partially alleviated by justice finally being served. But the pain of Dorothy, who never knew what really happened, would remain. She would always be remembered as the sister who didn't give up. The woman who, even without answers, never lost hope. Margaret Hamilton's story was finally resolved, but life in Carlinville would never be the same. The town would now live with the weight of this tragedy, with the burden of knowing that no matter how peaceful a community appears, evil can lurk where it's least expected. And no matter how much time passes, the scars of these revelations would never completely disappear. As the months passed, Carlinville, now forever scarred by the Margaret Hamilton case, began to adjust to its new reality. The streets, once quiet, were now permeated with a silent mourning, as if the entire town had lost something more than a beloved teacher. Residents' trust in one another was irreversibly shaken, and many began to view acquaintances more cautiously. Faces that had once been merely part of everyday life now carried the shadow of a mystery no one had imagined possible. The shops, once places of meeting and casual conversation, were now shrouded in an almost heavy silence. When residents passed each other on the street, their glances were more reserved. Some tried to avoid the pain of remembering what Fitzgerald had done. Others felt the need to gather and discuss the case, still unable to believe that someone like him could commit such a crime. People questioned each other constantly, but no matter how much they sought explanations, nothing seemed to justify the actions of a man who, for so long, was considered a paragon of respect and morality. When Fitzgerald was finally convicted, the town breathed a bitter sigh of relief. Although justice had been served, it did not bring Margaret back, nor could it heal the pain of Dorothy, who died without knowing the truth. Margaret's loss was even more painful for those who loved her, and the sadness of her absence echoed in the words of all who knew her. During all the years she was reported missing, many hoped she would return, that there would be a reasonable explanation for her disappearance. However, the truth that emerged was cruel and heartbreaking. The moment of Walter Fitzgerald's arrest, while a victory for justice, didn't bring the answers the city of Carlinville had hoped for. Even after his arrest and confession, people still wondered, how could such a horrific crime have been concealed for so long? Fitzgerald's facade as a good man, someone who belonged to the community and was respected by everyone, was what shocked residents the most. They never imagined he was capable of such a monstrous act, and this made the pain of loss even more difficult to bear. During his confession, Fitzgerald described how everything happened that night, and his words still echoed in the minds of everyone present. The pain in his words, the way he felt compelled to give this explanation after so many decades, was something no one could ever forget. He had lived with the guilt of Margaret's murder for 51 years, and the weight of that secret gnawed at him. When he finally came forward, it was not with a sense of redemption, but with the burden of a man who had finally faced the consequences of an unthinkable action. But the case wasn't closed with Fitzgerald's arrest alone. As the court proceedings unfolded, the city of Carlinville continued to suffer the ramifications of this revelation. Fitzgerald's trial, though brief, was painful for everyone involved. During the trial, the details of the crime were laid bare, and Fitzgerald's account of what happened that night became yet another stain on the city's history. He spoke with regret about the moment he lost control, about how pent-up feelings turned into an explosion of violence. For many, the explanation was incomprehensible. How could someone spend so many years with such profound pain and do nothing to make amends? As the trial progressed, some of the crime's indirect victims began to come forward. The people of Carlinville who had been closest to Fitzgerald, those who called him friend and confidant, were also deeply affected by the revelation of his guilt. For many, there was a sense of betrayal, as if a part of their own trust had been stolen. The children who grew up in the town, who passed by his hardware store, now had to face the reality that the man they admired was, in fact, a criminal. For new generations, Fitzgerald was no longer a local hero, but a man who, for his entire life, had lived with a secret so dark that he was no longer worthy of trust. The impact was even more profound for Margaret's friends, who also spent years not knowing what truly happened to her. Many remembered her as a young teacher full of life, who cared for everyone around her. She wasn't just an educator. She was a friend, a sister, a daughter. And for those who knew her, her death was an incalculable loss. Even after so long, they continued to carry the sadness of Margaret's absence, a sadness that would never be completely healed, for the lack of answers was as painful as the death itself. After the trial, the case was finally closed, but the city of Carlinville, like any community affected by such a serious crime, would never fully recover. Carlinville became, in some ways, a city marked not only by the loss of Margaret Hamilton, but also by the painful revelation that no matter how well people know each other, evil can lurk where they least expect it. The weight of what happened that night in 1957 weighed heavily on the shoulders of all the city's residents, and the memory of the pain the community experienced and would continue to experience would never be erased. Walter Fitzgerald died in 2010 after a long battle with Parkinson's disease, leaving behind a legacy of pain, guilt, and regret. He spent his final days deeply regretting his actions, but many believed this regret would not be enough to redeem him. He had taken a life, destroyed a family, and undone the thread of trust that bound Carlinville together. Despite his confession, he knew he could never make amends for the harm he caused, and when death took him, he was remembered not for his contribution to the community, but for the heinous crime he committed and concealed for so many decades. In 2010, Margaret Hamilton's remains finally received a proper burial, 52 years after her disappearance. The town gathered to say goodbye, but for many, it was more than a farewell ceremony. It was an attempt to find some kind of closure, to give the young teacher the peace she deserved. The scars the case had left in Carlinville would never completely disappear, but on that day, everyone was able, in some small way, to honor Margaret's memory. Though the town found answers, the pain they felt could never be fully erased. The mystery of Margaret Hamilton was finally solved. But the hardest lesson learned was that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. And, as the town of Carlinville learned the hard way, monsters don't always come from outside. Sometimes they live right alongside us, disguised as trusted people, and can devastate everything we love. As Carlinville struggled to process the revelations about Walter Fitzgerald, the town also grieved the loss of someone so integral to their lives, even if the impact of the loss was different. Margaret Hamilton, the 23-year-old teacher, always remembered for her kindness, warm smile, and dedication to her students, was no longer there. She represented the best the community had to offer, and now, an essential part of Carlinville's soul was lost forever. And, paradoxically, the town was also being forced to confront a very dark side of its past, a side that had always been there, hidden under the guise of normalcy. Margaret's story became not only a reminder of her absence, but also a warning. The town of Carlinville, which prided itself on its cohesion and sense of community, was not immune to the evil that can lurk in the shadows. Small towns in the United States, so often seen as havens of simplicity and peace, were not exempt from the complexities and tragedies that befell elsewhere. Margaret Hamilton's case brought to light a painful truth: the trust people place in one another can easily be broken, and appearances often hide terrible truths. While the town was immersed in a process of acceptance and reflection, many wondered how life could move forward. Younger generations, who hadn't experienced Margaret's disappearance and the relentless search for answers, began learning about the case through the stories their parents and grandparents told. Margaret's disappearance became a kind of urban legend, a mystery that haunted the minds of older residents and, in some ways, defined the town's identity. It was a story about broken trust, the pain of loss, and the gaps that can open up in people's lives when they least expect it. Conversations in stores, at the local market, and even in churches always seem to return to Margaret's case. It was nearly impossible for the town to move forward without her memory constantly present. For some, she became a symbol of all that Carlinville had lost. Not just a teacher, but a life cut short. A victim of the evil that existed all around them, camouflaged by a smile, by a respectable facade. The case also sparked intense debate about the nature of evil and people's ability to hide their intentions. Walter Fitzgerald, with his exemplary behavior over the years, became a stark example of how far people can deceive others and themselves. Even though many in the town never imagined he was capable of such cruelty, the fact that he was responsible for Margaret's death demonstrated that no one is above suspicion, and no one, no matter how respectable they may seem, is free from their own flaws and inner turmoil. Fitzgerald's arrest and confession also highlighted another aspect of life in Carlinville: the complex dynamics of class, power, and respect within the small community. Fitzgerald was influential, and this, in some ways, afforded him a degree of protection from further investigation during the years of Margaret's disappearance. His status as a hardware store owner, an active community member, and a respected figure in the town's churches made him virtually untouchable. His seemingly perfect demeanor, his intact family life, and his involvement in community events helped shield him. He used this facade to hide his actions, living with a burden of guilt that, even when he faced the possibility of being caught, never led him to turn himself in. As much as he tried to live with his secret, the truth always haunted him. Fitzgerald never imagined he would one day face justice. And although he was eventually arrested and convicted, he knew no punishment would be enough to make amends for what he had done. The pain of taking the life of such a promising young woman, the pain of his sister, who never knew what really happened, and the pain of seeing the entire community suffer from the tragedy were consequences he knew he would have to carry for the rest of his life. In the town, Margaret's memories grew more painful as time passed. Every school she had taught at, every child she had impacted, now became precious, but also painful memories. In a small town like Carlinville, where everyone knew everyone else, it was hard not to think of Margaret as someone who could have been a friend, a mother, a sister. But at the same time, she became a reminder of what could have been: a life cut short, a young woman destined to impact even more lives, but whose destiny was cruelly cut short. The city also began to reflect on the failures of local authorities, who for so long failed to solve the case. The Carlinville police and the investigators who worked there lacked the necessary tools to handle such a complex and mysterious case. New forensic investigation technologies, such as the use of DNA, had evolved greatly since the 1950s. And if such resources had been available back then, Margaret's case might have been solved much sooner. But, ironically, it was the persistence of a retired detective, Lawrence Gallagher, and the insistence of a new generation of investigators that finally brought the case to a close. The discovery of Margaret's remains in 1962, for example, was an important clue, but the lack of technical knowledge at the time meant that the discovery was dismissed without proper investigation. It was a clear example of what happened when resources were limited and small communities were at the mercy of investigations that, however well-intentioned, could not match the demands of a case of such magnitude. However, when the case was reopened in 2008, the town got a glimpse of the power of modern science, and the truth finally emerged, even if it was too late to give Dorothy the answer she had long sought. Now, with the case closed, Carlinville tried to move forward, but the scars would never completely fade. Margaret Hamilton's legacy, however, was not only the pain of her loss, but also the memory of her life. She represented all that was good about the town: the community spirit, the love of education, and the positive impact she had on everyone she crossed paths with. The pain of her loss still lingered, but the town also recognized the role Margaret played in their lives as a beacon of hope and goodness in a world that, however disconcerting, was also filled with beauty and compassion. The Margaret Hamilton case became more than just a local story of disappearance and resolution. For the Carlinville community, It became a hard-earned lesson in the fragility of human trust and how secrets can shape the fate of an entire town. After Fitzgerald's arrest, the town was on the brink of a revelation that would change everything. The pain of Margaret's loss, though never fading, was now accompanied by the frustration of knowing that justice had finally been served, but too late for her sister, Dorothy, to have the chance to see her search fulfilled. Dorothy, who spent decades writing letters, making phone calls, searching for an explanation, had never known the true tragedy that had befallen her life. The impact on Fitzgerald's family cannot be ignored either. His children, who had grown up believing in a father who was a role model for the community, now had to deal with the reality that this man was not what he seemed. They were among those most affected by the discovery, having to deal with the fact that their father, at the end of his life, was remembered more for his crime than for his life of respect for the community. For his children, the weight of knowing that their father was involved in the death of an innocent woman, a teacher so dear to the town's students and parents, was something that shattered the very sense of security they had for their family. The town, in turn, had to deal with the consequences of what Margaret Hamilton's case revealed about its own residents. Carlinville, a small community where everyone knew each other, never imagined such a heinous crime could happen right there, on its doorstep. The idea that evil could lurk in people who, at first glance, seemed trustworthy, created a climate of distrust that lingered for a long time. No matter how friendly someone was, or how integrated into town life, everyone now seemed to carry a shadow of suspicion. As the case became more widely known, broader discussions about the nature of justice and morality also emerged. How could Fitzgerald have hidden this secret for so long? The question many wondered was whether he truly regretted what he had done, or whether his confession was merely a last-ditch effort to relieve the pressure on him, knowing that death was approaching and that he would no longer have a chance to escape the weight of his guilt. Fitzgerald's words, though sad and full of regret, rang hollow to many who listened. There was no excuse or explanation sufficient to justify the brutal act he had committed. The weeks and months following her arrest saw the town plunged into a state of contemplation about what would happen to families, friendships, and the very fabric of trust among residents. How could a town built on close relationships and a strong sense of community resume normal life after such a devastating event? The truth is that, despite justice, what happened to Margaret left deep scars on Carlinville's collective psyche. One question that remained open for many was the psychological impact of living in a town where such a violent and treacherous crime had been committed unsuspectingly. Many wondered how many other secrets lay hidden from everyone, right under their noses. The town, which had seemed like a haven of tranquility, was now marked by the certainty that evil could lurk anywhere, even in the people closest to them. Trust, something that had always been the foundation of rural life, had been deeply shaken. The analysis of the case also sparked reflection on how small towns handle violent crime and how a lack of resources can hinder solving a case. If modern forensic technology had been available in 1957, Margaret's case could have been solved much faster. The use of DNA, which ultimately proved crucial to solving the case, was not available to authorities at the time. For the local population, the case also revealed the limitations of a system that relies on limited resources and knowledge, especially in such a small town with few tools and less access to advanced investigative techniques. As the city struggled to heal, Margaret's legacy continued to be celebrated in quiet but meaningful ways. In the schools where she taught, memories of her were palpable, with former students speaking of the impact she had on their lives, sharing stories of the lessons she taught them, not just about books and numbers, but about the importance of being a good person, trusting others, and doing good. Although the town of Carlinville has slowly begun to rebuild, Margaret Hamilton's story remains in its depths, not as a reminder of a tragedy, but as a reminder that truth always finds a way to emerge, no matter how much time passes. Even if it wasn't in the time frame they'd hoped, the town finally had the chance to give Margaret the peace she deserved. Her death, though painful, wasn't in vain. She somehow helped open the town's eyes to a truth no one wanted to face, but one that was crucial for growth and change. The final memorial service, held in November 2009, was a moving event for the town, but also a milestone in the healing process. The Carlinville community was finally able to honor Margaret in a dignified manner as the person she was, without the shadow of the mystery surrounding her death. That young teacher, who dedicated herself to education and the well-being of her community, deserved more than the silence of a disappearance. She deserved to be remembered as someone who, even after her death, brought the town the truth and justice that had been sorely lacking. Now, Margaret Hamilton's case was no longer an endless mystery, but a story of redemption. While the pain of loss would never be erased, the city had learned an important lesson about the nature of trust, justice, and resilience. The closure of Margaret's case, with Fitzgerald's arrest and confession, brought relief, but also forced the city to reflect deeply on how to deal with the traumas of the past and ensure something like this never happened again. After Walter Fitzgerald's arrest and confession, Carlinville was forever scarred. The town would never be the same. Fitzgerald, who had been respected for so many years, was now viewed differently. He became a symbol of a hard-to-accept truth. Evil can hide beneath the most innocent appearances. The sense of betrayal was palpable. Residents, who had trusted him for decades, now had to process the reality that this man they knew had committed such a horrific crime and kept it a secret for so many years. The emotional impact of all this was profound. Fitzgerald wasn't just a member of the community. He was someone who had been trusted, someone who helped with local parades, school events, and church. The fact that he lived the life of a respectable person while hiding such a dark secret caused trust among the people of Carlinville to be irreparably broken. For Fitzgerald's children, the weight of the revelation was unbearable. They grew up believing in a father who was a role model, a pillar of the community. But when they discovered the truth, their worlds crumbled. They had to deal with the pain of betrayal and the shame of knowing that their own father had caused such a profound tragedy. For them, the man they called father became a stranger, someone they no longer knew. And then there was the question of the impact on the community. Carlinville, like any small town, was defined by its close relationships and mutual trust among its residents. When someone committed a crime, the entire town felt it. But in Fitzgerald's case, this crime was different. He wasn't a stranger, but someone everyone knew, and this created an even deeper kind of loss. How can a town move forward when it discovers that evil has been right before its eyes all along? As the town struggled to rebuild, many began to question how authorities had handled the case all those years. The lack of answers for so long caused frustration. If modern forensic science had been available in 1957, perhaps Margaret's case would have been solved more quickly. When DNA was finally used to identify Margaret's remains, the town received confirmation of something that had already been deeply felt by everyone. What more could have been solved if the right resources had been available at the time? Furthermore, the authorities' failures weren't limited to the investigation into Margaret's case. The way the case was initially handled, with a slow and often unfocused investigation, was a painful lesson for the town. Many believed Fitzgerald had benefited from his standing in the community. His social status had protected him, even though, over the years, he had been just another piece of a mystery no one could solve. But when the truth finally came out, it was devastating not only for Fitzgerald, but for everyone who thought they knew him. Fitzgerald's trial was a moment of liberation for Carlinville, but it also brought great grief. The images of a man so physically and emotionally weakened admitting his crime contrasted with the image of a man who had, for so many years, been a good neighbor, a good father, a good husband. But more than that, Fitzgerald was the man everyone distrusted. He was the friend, the mentor, the active member of the community. This made the pain all the more unbearable, as if the town had been deceived by someone who was an essential part of its identity. The trial wasn't just about Fitzgerald's actions, but also about how the city dealt with the loss of trust. The sentence was more than just punishment. It was an attempt to give Margaret Hamilton the justice she had so tragically lost. But even after the arrest and trial, Nothing could truly erase the impact this story had on the lives of those who lived through it. After his arrest, Fitzgerald spent his final days in a weakened physical state. Parkinson's disease had left him frail. Even so, he knew that nothing he went through would be enough to repair the pain he had caused so many people, especially Margaret's sister, Dorothy, who never had the chance to see justice served. Fitzgerald's belated confession brought some peace to the town, but also raised many questions about what could have been done differently. Margaret's 2009 memorial service was not only an occasion to honor her memory, but also an opportunity for the town to seek some form of closure. The pastor's words echoed throughout the small church. Justice was late, but it is never too late for truth. Carlinville finally had the chance to pay its last respects to Margaret, but the town knew it could never erase the pain and loss that remained. Even with the case solved, Carlinville couldn't simply move on. The pain of discovery and loss was too much. The scars wouldn't fade so easily, but there was also a sense of responsibility that the town needed to remember Margaret for who she truly was. Not just as the victim, but as the teacher, the sister, the friend, who made a difference in so many lives. The town finally recognized that the truth, though difficult to swallow, was necessary to heal what was broken. Margaret Hamilton, though physically lost, would never be forgotten. The town of Carlinville, over time, began to rebuild itself from the painful lessons this case taught. People, though wary now, also learned to appreciate more the importance of truly knowing those around them. And for those who survived, Margaret's case was a constant reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight, how trust can be broken, but above all, how the truth, even if it takes time to surface, will always find a way to be revealed.